So my name is Laurel Mueller, and I am a certified professional soil scientist, and I have a company that I own. I started in 1983 called Soil Services Company, Inc. And I have a second company called Mountain Wastewater Management, which sells and services sewage system product because sewage systems tends to be currently our main business. And I'm situated in north central Pennsylvania. We serve Northeast and North Central, and yet it's not unusual that I go back to my county where I started my business for 18 years to Bucks County in Southeast. Next week, I'm actually looking at soils for a monastery in Adams County, which is down near Gettysburg. And we just finished a design out by Pittsburgh. So we do get all around the state, but really most of our work is centered in Northeast and North Central Pennsylvania and dominantly in the glacial till area. So I was asked to create a presentation. And what I'm not is a professor. I'm not an academic. I don't normally publish. I do a lot of presentations, and I didn't really have one on forest soils, but I was asked, since I work in soils, mainly in the forest every day, and I do a lot of contemplating and a lot of evaluation of forest soil conditions. And I make a lot of observation about trees and shrubs because they're my clue on where the drainage is right for finding septic systems. I assembled this presentation from a sort of a composite of several other presentations and some unique to chestnut growers. So I was asked to do a Forest Soils 101. And so I'm going to cover a little bit about my background and what soil scientists are and what the consultants do. And then I'm going to talk about soil surveys, especially the current web soil survey, which is the digital version of what used to be published books in every county, and how to make good how to grab good information out of the soil survey for your purposes, in particular drainage class information. And then knowing the limitations of soil surveys, what can be done for high intensity investigations for various purposes, sometimes for permits, sometimes for vineyards, sometimes for mining. I have a client that's a tree grower. I'm going to give you a little bit about that. So what can we do to get more information, more intense information on specific properties about soil characteristics and suitability for planting chestnut trees? So to describe the soil survey, I'm going to talk a little bit about how soils form on a landscape, which is how it is that soil surveys can be soil surveyors, soil scientists can actually make maps because there's some principles of how soils form on a landscape. They are mappable because they're the result of a combinations of geology and topography, and because of that, they are mappable. And so I'm going to share with you a little bit about that. And the same principles are used when we do the detailed mapping. I'll give you some about soil profile descriptions. And then, of course, we're going to key in more toward the end of my talk about what soils are right for chestnut trees and how do we find them. All right, so this is just about myself and my business. I grew up in Pennsylvania. I'm a native to Pennsylvania, but I went to school in New Hampshire, a forestry school, University of New Hampshire. And I also did a master's degree in the University of Montana School of Forestry in Missoula. And but my focus in my undergraduate degree was land use planning. And I took all of the soils classes, and it was a different time. In 1971, I asked if I could major in soils because I was doing well in all the soil classes, and I was told that that was not for girls. Hiss, boo. And so I didn't get to, I finished a degree in resource economics, and I went and did a master's degree where I focused on soil physics related to forestry. And I graduated from University of Montana with my master's degree and got my first career opportunity in Medford, Oregon. And so that's me on the far left in 1977. And I always say this is the picture where I had a waistline. Anyway, things change over time. So that was me doing, actually it was a PR picture because there were no other women in the soil survey. And I was kind of an breaker, ground, whatever. I was, my claim to fame is I was the first pregnant soil surveyor, and they didn't know what to do with me. There was just no protocol for how to handle that situation. But I mapped until my due date. And anyway, it was a wonderful career. I stayed with the federal government for 7.5 years in Southwestern Oregon. And still, when we had 2 children, we wanted to move back to Pennsylvania for family reasons, and the government couldn't accommodate me. So I quit, came back, entered into a clock manufacturing company, my family's business, and that lasted less than a year. It was a terrible torture, and I didn't know what else to do employment-wise. And so as an act of desperation, I started a company. And so my first company was in Bucks County. I serviced mainly Bucks and Montgomery, Chester, some into Delaware, Philadelphia, and a lot of sewage system work. I did archaeology work, expert testimony, wetland mapping. There was a time there were 3 wetland mappers in Pennsylvania. I was one of the first of one of those 3. That was back in the late 80s. Eventually, my company moved to our family farm in the middle of nowhere, and in Sullivan County, Forksville. And so anyway, this is just the evolution of my brochure. I started my career, as I mentioned, on soil survey. I was a mapper of soils, and my duty was from Crater Lake, Oregon, you can see in the upper right, all the way to the Pacific Ocean. And I did map about 250,000 acres. And when you do that mapping, you can accomplish in your agricultural valley lands about 300 acres a day. And it's all done with hand tools and reading of the terrain and understanding some basic principles of where soils fall on the landscape. The mapping in the Forest Service, the Bureau of Land Management and U.S. Forest Service lands, that was done at about 1,000 acres a day, again, with all hand tools. And, I wish I had then the tools that we have now. We didn't have a cell phone. We didn't have GPS. We didn't have topography mapping that was in great detail. So my way of soil mapping then was, I'd have to take an air photo and watch how the curvature of the logging road went and count 3 curves on the logging road and say, okay, I'm facing north. And that's how I knew where I was. So the soil survey mapping was accomplished by a lot of air photo interpretation of location. So we didn't have just the benefit of, I used to dream, couldn't there just be something to tell me where I am? And GPS was only a dream, only a notion then. And the other thing I always wished for was the rocket pack, like something that would bounce you from this ridge to the next ridge with no effort, instead of hiking 6 hours to get there just to dig a hole and sample soil. And again, I emphasize hand tools, all done with shovels and augers and reading of soil profiles in road cuts. That's soil survey. So what are soil scientists? I am on a Soil Science Society of America board, and I'm also on an examination board, which certifies professional soil scientists. There is licensing in some states, about 13 states, and the rest of the states, there's no licensing, but we have this national certification process through the SSSA. Just my favorite Gary Larson cartoon of soil scientist school digging on the floor. The soil scientists have a Bachelor of Science degree, and then they have a big exam after 5 years of experience. And so your credentials are evaluated, and then you take this exam, and then you can get certified. If you are in a licensed state, or if you're an earlier version of certification, there were 2 exams, but there's now nationally 1. And then we have Code of Ethics, and we have continuing certification credits, CEUs, education unit credits. So that's just me, the old days when I had, like I said, my waistline. I have less of a waistline now, but that I live in soil test pits. So I just wanted you to know every day I go out, if I'm not stuck at the computer writing reports, I am in the field, and it's usually in the woods, and I'm being probed by roots from all sides after a backhoe opens the test pit. So I wind up in the forest a lot, even if I have a property with a lawn or an ag field. And the reason is I am usually in pursuit of soils that are good condition, well aerated, well drained, and where I find that soil is in the woods. When I'm in a cornfield, the soil is compacted, tighter, thinner, and in an area, especially in the glacial till, where the water table resides 1 to 2 feet deep, if that soil has had soil loss of the surface or compaction, the magic 20 inches we need to find for a suitable sewage system isn't there. But my observations, to find these places, I use trees, tree species, landscape shape to zone in on where it is I want to find that great soil. And I always ask, my very first question is, and this goes back to, I worked with archaeologists for 20 years, evaluating the age of strata for finding cultural resources from prior civilizations. And uh, one of the questions is always, was this land ever plowed? Because the entire history is revealed. When we open a test pit, we can find, did somebody live there? Did somebody till it? And I might be sitting there at 2-foot diameter cherry trees, but it may have been open 100 years ago to 200 years ago as a broccoli field. And I can tell that history when I open a test pit. So a very, very basic principle always taught in Soils 101 is the 5 soil forming principles, for 5 soil forming factors. So a soil is a result of how long material from a parent material sat on a landscape and in what climate, and interacting with what kind of organisms. And when I say organisms, we're talking the plants, but we're also talking everything that died on that landscape. Soils have been the receiving zone for excrement and death forever. And soils have cleaned up magically. Before we understood bacterial science or chemistry, we relied on soils making clean water out of foul water. So whether it was the Roman bath water or dinosaur poop, we went to the soil cleaned it up. When the water went through soil and then rocks and then surfaced again in streams and or wells today, the water is clean because of what soil does. So organisms can be the bacteria, the fungi, the roots, the dead plant matter, the dead animal matter, all the little critters that are microscopic. So they all play into soil development. The parent material is the rock material or the deposit you start with. And then once you're in a region and you're in the same climate and the same parent material, similar organisms, the relief, where you are in the terrain, whether you're on the summit of the hill or the foot slope or the outwash terrace or the floodplain, that has more localized, causes more localized difference in soils than anything else. But because soils are derived from the parent, because they fall into a pattern on a landscape, and they change with the geology as the geology changes across the landscape, they are mappable. And it is because they are mappable that a person with hand tools can read a landscape and vegetation and go out and put a line on a map and call it the soil survey. So a little bit on parent materials. When we talk about parent materials, they are rock types or deposits. So a shale soil, which might be a bright red shale or a dark gray shale, will produce a fine textured soil, meaning clay, lots of clay. A sandstone, which is comprised of a sedimentary rock that is sand particles, will produce a sandy soil, often better drained, but not always. A granite, we don't have any granite in Pennsylvania, or maybe we do, but I haven't been in it. Or schist in south central Pennsylvania. We have the micaceous schists. Those produce very deep, well-drained soils with tiny little sparkle flakes in them. So a soil starts with a rock, but if it wasn't a rock, it might be a deposit. In my neck of the woods in north central PA, we have glacial till, sand and gravel and boulders that were deposited by a mile thick layer of ice. And then after that deposit, we have, there were many lacustrine areas that were in the concave landscapes and beside the current river channels. There were large lakes that were formed, sometimes blocked by ice, part of the melting process, and those left a deposit called glaciolacustrine deposits. And then aeolian, and I have to tell you, aeolian is one of my favorite words because it has 7 letters, and I played it in Scrabble one time, and I used up all my letters, and that was 50 points. But aeolian means windblown deposit, and I didn't get credit for my spelled 7-letter word in Scrabble because it wasn't in the Webster's dictionary, but it is in a geologist or geomorphologist or soil scientist dictionary, and it means windblown deposit. And I'm going to describe a little bit about in our area. We have basically all over Pennsylvania, we have usually a residual soil on the bottom, but we have loess deposits, thin and thick, all over the top of the soil. And usually we will find a silty soil that's rock-free, that's part of that alien deposit. Colluvial means landslide, and alluvial, most of you are acquainted with, means a floodplain deposit. So a word on loess, L-O-E-S-S. And if you're in the Midwest, they call it lurse, but there's no R. It is a very underrepresented parent material in Pennsylvania. And when I find it on the landscape, let's see, its origin was glacial lakes that dried up and had no vegetation after the glaciers retreated, became the source of silt and very fine sand that blew. And it blew into areas like a snowstorm. And it's very evident today. I have the comment here, rocks don't fly. If I have a rock-free soil over a rocky soil, one filled with rocks and stones, it is most commonly because the loess, loess is the result of particle size separation, meaning you're quite acquainted with gravel bars and sandbars in streams, for example. Fast-moving water will drop large cobbles and sand, and slow-moving water will drop as sediment, fine particles, the clay and the silt. So that's based on the velocity of the water. Well, the velocity of the wind did the same thing. The clays were stuck behind because they were clumped together, and the stones didn't fly. So what you have are these big drifts of silt loam and very fine sand that cover the landscape, and they are now part of the soil. The classic color is 7.5 YR 4/4. It's kind of a salmon reddish brown. So in every soil survey, in the old published paper soil surveys, there would be a landscape block diagram. And that was for the soil scientists that did the mapping to communicate to the user of the soil survey or anybody else who was trying to do detailed mapping, where do the soils fall in the landscape? Now, I don't know, I'm hoping my cursor shows. I think it does. But you'll see here's a soil called an R-knot soil at the very top, A-R-N-O-T, which is funny because it's kind of like an R-knot soil. It's mostly rock. And your summits will be, your summits are usually the shallowest to bedrock and some of the best drainage. Then your shoulder or your hill, or here the shoulder, there's Oquaga soil here. This is one common in the Northeast. Is one of your very best drained and deepest soils in the glacial till, and it's on the convex shoulder of the hill. And when the landscape slips into concave, such as with this marsh soil on the far left, M-O-R-R-I-S, that's one of the worst drainage soils around, and it sits in the concave part of the landscape. So the landscape drives depth to bedrock and depth to seasonal high water table. So it's really important. This happens on a very large scale regionally, but it also happens on a very small scale. I can be on a half-acre lot and watch the land undulate from convex to concave and find the soil difference in drainage just in that, in a 50 to 100 feet. So this is very important when you're spotting these areas for growing trees and you're looking for good drainage. Convex versus concave drives this water table feature. All right, these are just the tools the soil scientists use to make the soil surveys. In my logo for my company is the sharpshooter shovel in the upper left. Then there's the hard hand-turned auger. We have guides for how to describe soil. We used to have the topographic maps with 20-foot contours. I only wish then that the 2-foot contours that are available in Pennsylvania called LIDAR could be used, because those are so useful now. We use vegetation. So having to understand at all times a year what the bark and bud and leaf look like on a tree helps us understand by what species is there, a lot about the depth, a lot about the drainage. You'll see in a lot of my pictures coming up, there's a Munsell color chart, which is how we define the color of a soil, pruning snips to get those roots from not poking you in your ears and eyes, and sometimes a rock hammer. So I also used to have a good story that would help me get into public land. When you're not on public land and you're in private land, the good story is, I'm from the government, I'm here to help you. So you'd have to have a good story to have a chat, to go to a owner and say why it is they would like you to invite you in to look at their soil to be part of the government soil survey. The soil lines on a soil survey were done before we went to the field. All soil surveyors were taught stereoscopic vision. We used a stereoscope, looked at pairs of aerial photos that were taken in sequence, and these scopes make your eyes do a trick where you start to see three-dimension. I used to spend hours and hours and hours on the back tailgate of a pickup truck with my stereoscope, looking at these pairs of air photos to try to make sense of where's ridge tops, where are shoulders, where are terraces, where are alluvial fans, etc., to define the landscape. And that let you draw the line, and then you go out and confirm within the line what the soils are that you're finding. And with a suspicion, you have a suspicion of what it's going to be, and you go out and confirm. Today, this LiDAR, there's a whole different method of doing elevation contour lines. This is just a graphic showing how LiDAR is made. There's two parts to the LiDAR information. And I should say that we have this in Pennsylvania as a benefit of the gas industry. There was a negotiation between our state geologist and the gas industry about paying for making LiDAR available. So this is an image. And so if you were to do an image of even a forest today, you'll see the old landscape below the trees. LiDAR picks up both elevations and images that are below the tree canopy. So below the tree canopy, I might see an old farm that exists in what is today cherry trees. So in my own farm, we have what was a hay pasture when my husband was a child, and it's now got 2-foot diameter cherry trees on it. So there's a lot of land that was scalped, cleared for many reasons. My own area was just treeless for 150 years ago, and then the trees have grown back and the forest has come back, but some of the other uses are still evident in the soil. And so this is just a view of what you might see, and it might all be covered with trees, but it'll provide some evidence of what used to be. So soils are described by horizonation. The A horizon is the organic surface, and E horizon isn't always present. It is in a virgin forest, but it's not usually present in what was plowed. So the E horizon stands for eluviated. It means stripped of sesquioxides, and I'm going to show you what that means when iron and aluminum are stripped from the soil and migrate through the soil. They leave a pale layer and then a deposit of color. The B horizon is where there's the maximum structure, and a C horizon is undeveloped, without structure. And then R is, of course, bedrock. And each of these horizons has many other little fine-tuned subhorizon sublabels. So B might be BX for fragipan, or BT for translocated clay, such as A might have a P for plow layer, etc. Using horizon sequences and thicknesses, we separate soils through a classification system, and there are 12 orders in the world. But the more common soils in Pennsylvania will be altisols and alphasols. Those have highly developed B horizons. And inceptisols, which are minimally developed, those are ones that we find in glacial till. And we will find entosols on the floodplain, and occasionally what's called a histosol in a wetland. Not worth going into all those details, but know that we do have a classification system. And we also have standards. We have standards for the language we use to describe soil. Soil taxonomy is the classification system. We have the textural triangle for separating particle sizes into textures. Those of us that do wetland mapping have very explicit directives on what is or is not a hydric soil. There's standards for how soil surveys were made, and of course, certified professional soil scientists, formerly called the name at the top, ARCPA, American Registry of Certified Professionals in Agronomy, Crops, and Soils. That was the first name for certified soil scientists, and now they're just CPSS. So texture, we use a triangle, and it's kind of hard to follow this triangle, but on this side, on the left side is clay, on the right side is silt, and on the bottom, and it all goes clockwise in percentage from 0 to 100. So sand, clay, silt as you go around this chart. So you follow a line in, and let's just say you were 30% silt, 30% silt, but you were 50% clay and only a little bit of sand. It's a texture called clay. But when we're used to the name loam, loam is a nice healthy mix of all of those particle sizes, clay being the smallest and sand being the largest and silt being the in-between. So loam is a balance where you've got 20% clay, not a lot of clay, just enough to hold the soil together, 40% sand, and up in here, you're 40 to 50% silt. So a nice balance of some grit, some sticky stuff, but the majority of it is silt, so a loam. And then if it weighs heavily toward silt, it's silt loam. If it weighs heavily toward clay, we have sandy loam. I'm sorry, clay loam. And if it gets more sand, you're over to sandy loam. So that's how the textures work. We also are very explicit about the adjective used, whether it's stony, gravelly, channery, based on percent and the nature of the rock. A cobble is round, a channer is flat. So we're very specific. Believe me, there's a quantitative definition for every word we use in soil science when we do soil profile descriptions. So structure, very, very important. We find that surfaces are granular. That means round, crumb, soft. We find that subsoils are blocky. We have subangular, blocky, and angular. Mainly in Pennsylvania, we have subangular, blocky. And platy doesn't occur very often, except when man has usually had an impact on the soil through trampling, machine work, cropping. So those are your primary structures we have in Pennsylvania. And then friability, a very important, when you see lingo that says it's friable or firm, these are very important words to tell you about the condition of the soil. Friable is what we like for nice healthy roots and gardens, and firm is when the water stops moving through the soil and so do the roots. So this is just a picture of a soil profile description, the kind of thing I produce every day. So that we name the horizon that this is a plow layer that's 12 inches thick. It's channery silt loam. It has a quantifiable color from the Munsell color book. It has structure, which is strong, medium, granular structure, very friable at the top. And we even describe the boundary, which is abrupt and smooth. So it has a shape and a span that a horizon change can be gradual or abrupt. So a B is a structural B, but not a heavily laden with not a heavy clay subhorizon. So if it were, it would be a BT. So BW is a structural B. It's 12 to 28 inches. It's a different color than the top channery silt loam, and it has subangular blocky structure, and it's friable. And in this case, we have a BX of fragipan, and it's 28 to 30 inches. Color is similar, but has depleted colors and concentrated colors, something I'm going to show you pictures of coming up, and usually just some comments also on the profile description. All right, so drainage and tree species indicators. From the mapping standpoint, if I were going to drive by a terrain, wanted to know what the soil drainage is, I would look at the tree species. And the same thing when I get down to the nitty gritty, I'm walking and I'm trying to point to where the backhoe is going to dig for my finding of good drainage for a septic system. So I have, in my own experience, there's a federal standards for wetland mapping where they rank soils into 6 different categories, from upland to facultative wet. They have 6 categories for saying which plants most likely are going to be found in wet soils and which ones are in well-drained soils. Well, before they ever developed that chart, soil surveyors and anybody mapping landscapes for drainage would rely on trees without such a scale published, but just the knowledge. And so in my own experience, if I want a guaranteed best drainage soil I'll ever see, I'll go to flowering dogwood and sassafras. Now, they're not very common trees, but when I see them, boy, I know I can get a good drainage hole. In my general experience, next rank down and more common would be black cherry, American beech, white oak, red oak, rock oak, birch, white ash, which is now dying thanks to the emerald ash borer, the sugar maple, the black locust, and crabapple and sumac. Those are all indicative of very good drainage. And this is where you want to be, if you're going to pick a landscape, if you're going to have use trees as indicators of drainage, this is the landscape where your chestnuts belong, because you want the good drainage. And when you start getting into species like red maple, silver maple, striped maple, spice bush, pin oak, sweet gum, those are indicators of poorer drainage. They'll go hand in hand with a concave landscape. So I've seen this map a variety of times, the range of the chestnut tree, and the range is not the habitat. The range is the full extent of where this tree species has grown, but it doesn't mean that all landscapes within these counties and this range will grow a chestnut. So you're going to start honing in on where the better drainage is by the convex landscapes. And so if you really wanted to know where does the tree grow, this map would be very speckled, limiting itself to certain landscapes. This is a generalized soil map of Pennsylvania, and you can see through Pennsylvania we have a lot of differences. This big pink zone in the northeast is your glacial till. We have the coastal plains, and we have the Appalachian mountain ridges through the center. So they're based on geology and based on topography and based on where you sit in relation to what's called geomorphic provinces. You have many, many varieties of soil, and yet all of the state was colored green for chestnut. So within the area that is part of the range, we're going to start zeroing in on where are certain soils that really do well for chestnuts. So using a soil survey. So this is just a real briefing on when you go to, you no longer use the old books, you go to the computer and web soil survey just by punching in the word web soil, and you'll get there. And you start with this green button, it says start here. And the first thing you're going to do is identify an area, and it could be 5 acres and it could be 100 acres. But I will tell you, if it gets to be small, you'll get this warning pop up at the bottom in this orange box. And I use this a lot in court testimony to explain why soils aren't exactly what the map says. A soil survey, if you zoom in really close and want a lot of tight information for a 5-acre tract, you're going to get this warning that says, that don't rely on this at this scale, because there's 5-acre units that aren't part of the soil survey. In other words, if the different soil was only 5 acres in size, we wouldn't even separately map it. It would just be considered an inclusion. So one of the very useful things is to hit some of the tabs at the top until you get to this one called soil properties and qualities and drainage class. And then you have to push this thing called view rating. And when you push view rating, this colorized map comes up, which is very, very useful for you to begin to envision. If you see this, here's a red zone that's excessively drained. And this yellow zone, it's well drained. And then you get to some of the, when you start getting the greens and the blues, as shown on this little, there's a little color-coded chart that goes with this, then you know your drainage is beginning to get impeded. Very, very useful, quick and dirty way to get information. But we find that the soil maps are not intensive enough for land development planning, for example. So when we are looking for stormwater facilities and sewage systems, we do many, many test pits. And this same technique we've used for identifying apple orchards, vineyards, and I'll show you the example of a tree grower that we did a detailed map for. Soil scientists also will carry through and do tests to get quantitative rates, such as saturated hydraulic conductivity for stormwater facilities, for example. We do mapping of wetlands and waters. Again, one of the restricted areas by federal and state law. So that's me on the left hanging a tree, flag on a tree, and a picture of gray soils that happen in the hydrology of a wetland. This is just Google Earth picked up one of my fields where I did a grid of test pits. This was a hay field that some people wanted to turn into a land development, and today it serves the gas industry and a bunch of office buildings. So those holes were turned into a map from that. I created a map of varying soils. This particular soil was a miserable drainage in the center. I'm hoping you see my cursor. And because of it, it became a lake that was part of a stormwater facility. And the good areas for sewage disposal were all identified, and this property got built based on this inventory. Using always the principles of well-aerated soils or in the convex area. You know, when I see it isn't just connect the dots after we do all those test pits. It's seeing what I'm in on a convex landscape in that sampled spot. I can project across the landscape through the convex area. So really, really important. This the summit, shoulder, the back slope, the foot slope are a transition from convex to concave, and your good drainage soils are going to be in the convex landscape, especially the shoulders, because the summits are frequently shallow to bedrock. All right, this is a guy, a friend of mine in Bucks County, who has a business called Trees and Travel. And his business, this is where I really got to understand the value of mycorrhizal fungi, which are in the soil, for tree growth. And his business, he basically sells $10,000 trees to people that need instant sheltering from something ugly that moved in next door. So if you want a row of Norway spruce and you don't want to wait 25 years for it to mature, you hire this guy. And this is done a lot in the commercial world and in high-end houses. So he has a Vermeer digger, but he grows trees in nursery style, but he enhances the root growth so that's his hand holding a bundle of roots. And literally, if you had a regular tree without mycorrhizal fungi and in this kind of enhanced development of roots, it would look just like your hand. You would have little tiny root, coarse roots and no fine roots. But instead, he feeds these trees composted tea and compost tea and mycorrhizal fungi, which are part of a natural forest, and it enhances the root growth by bringing in moisture and nutrients from across an entire large landscape to that tree. So it's a very important thing to think about in developing hardy, healthy, transportable trees. This is one of his root balls under one of the trees he's ready to sell. And he was expanding his operation and was going to buy a farm next door. So he said, can we use your soil mapping technique to tell me where my trees will do best? And sure enough, that's what we did. So this is a map we made for him by a grid of test pits that were essentially a transect, a sampling in linear fashion across the terrain. And we were able to take the green area there and say where the water table and the dense fragipan underneath were deepest, 20 to 29 inches, and where they were even deeper yet in that orange area, and then where the water table began to come up. And which, if you are able to read the contour lines on here, all the concave areas are where the water table was shallower, even to the two blue dots, which were potential pond site areas. And we did the same thing for depth to bedrock. The map here on the right is depth to bedrock as opposed to water table. Digging was an important matter. So we found where was the deepest rock. Well, it was where the blue was a deeper rock, but and up on the summit where the yellow is, the rock got shallower. And then we had a really shallow ledge going through there, which is the orange. And then he was acquiring this land, so we also did a mapping for the purpose of sewage system feasibility, just to understand the value of the land if it were ever to be land developed. So that's the map on the left. So I want to explain about difference of going from a farm field into a virgin forest. And when I say virgin, I mean a place that was never plowed. And in my neck of the woods, never plowed is usually where the boulders are or the steepness is. So if it was just not worth it to the farmer to clear the rocks, because there were so many boulders that were big, ugly ones, or it was too steep to mess with farm implements, then those areas left undisturbed, never plowed, and possibly never cleared are the virgin forests. And they're my favorite landscapes for finding good conditioned soil. So
Laurel,
in those,
well, sorry
yes.
to interrupt, but if I can give you about a 5-minute warning to wrap up, and then we can do a couple questions.
Okay, very
But
good.
and since you're you mentioned plow, I have several questions from Steve Johnsonbaugh. Maybe you can address that and then
Okay.
finish up on what you're doing. But he's asked several questions about plow pans. Is
Yep.
platy associated with the plow pan?
Platy
Platy.
soils, that's a structure. is connected with a plow pan, and I actually have a picture of that coming up.
Okay, and then is a plow pan typically a narrow, easily identified pan?
It is narrow, and it is often resolvable with some deeper plowing.
Okay. And
Yes.
then so yeah, and then he asked what's the best practice and low impact method to break through a plow pan. And I don't know if you have this too, but I encounter a lot of fragipans in soils that people want to plant on. Can you, I don't know if you want to do that now or later, but just how do you
That's
break those
exactly
things
what I
up?
have coming up as the pictures of the
Fantastic.
fragipan.
All right.
So
Thank
I
you.
apologize. I may go a little longer,
Okay.
just than the 5 to cut these covered, but I have,
Let's go 10 then, because we did
okay,
start 10 minutes late. So if we can go
very
about
good.
10 minutes, we'll wrap it up.
Okay, very good. Okay.
Thanks.
Okay. So in the forest that has not been plowed, there's a common sequence in the surface we call OEBS, which is the organic horizon, eluviated, which is stripped of color and stripped of aluminum and iron, and then where it all accumulates is the brighter red color, BS. So I'm going to show you some pictures of that. Most commonly throughout most of Pennsylvania, unless you are in a deep well-drained soil, you have a fragipan, and it is brittle, it is water perching, and I'll be showing you those pictures. And then throughout the forest, unlike the farm field, we have mycelia. We have a fungal life. The fungus, the mushrooms, uh, have long tentacles that go through the soil and connect tree roots to nutrients and moisture. It's a symbiosis. Um, Man's impact on soil are very visible. The compaction with the Palladian firm soils are something I'll show you a picture of. We are missing the original surface horizons, such that they're just gone. They have eroded and they land at the bottom of the field, or they run off in a waterway. The pH, once the soil has been limed, the pH is changed, and sometimes forever. So when you're seeking the acidity, the fact that it got limed 100 years ago for farming, that residual lime is still in that soil, and it doesn't ever return to being quite as acid. And then the surface boulders are all rearranged and cleared. And there's a unique smell of forest soils. If I were blindfolded and given a cornfield soil and a forest soil, I could tell you the difference by the smell. And I think a lot of that is the fungal matter and the decomposition that's in the forest soil. Okay, this is just an image to have you begin to understand the fungus life. And it's interesting, what took out the chestnut was a fungus that came from Asia. And today, the benefit, well, there's good and bad of fungus in soil. So the fungus that is the beneficial one is the mycorrhizal one, the one that's helping the roots get moisture and nutrients. But right now there's a fungus, 2 of them have been identified for the spotted lanternfly, that are actually working against that new pest that's killing fruit trees and ultimately nut trees. There's a fungus that's actually thwarting the progress of that pesty bug. This is just another image of how it's all connected. The roots connect to the mycelia, and the mycelia flower when the time is right into mushrooms. And in the lower right is a picture I took last week of some mycelia that I saw in a surface soil. And this is just a chicken in the woods. It's called mushroom growing on a tree. And when you do see the mushrooms on the trees, it's the first sign that there's something wrong with the tree. But some of them are wonderful to collect. So ground cover, very important. In addition to the tree species, if you're looking down and not up, here's a picture on the far left of cinquefoil, and on the right, Virginia creeper, and then the ground cover by hay-scented fern. These are all indicators of good drainage. Also detritus, that's the dead matter that's on the top of the soil, which in leaf matter. When it's black and gray and colorless, it's wet. And when it's tan and buff colored, it's not wet. So those go hand in hand with hydric soils. Of course, when hills start to sink and you start seeing sedges and rushes and ponded water and skunk cabbage and even a marsh violet, you know that the landscape's getting wetter. Without looking up at the trees, you know by looking down at the ground cover. So where you don't want to be for growing chestnut trees is, here's a wetland flag going into a woods at the top. And you'll see the roots start popping out of the ground on some hemlock trees, and the hay-scented fern starts disappearing, and we go into the concave landscape where water is in the holes and the soils are turning gray at the surface. This is a fragipan. I'm glad you mentioned it, Sarah. When we open a hole and see a vertical stripe through the soil, it is a prism face. Prisms are a very large structure, often hexagonal in shape, and where we encounter the edge of them, we'll see this white stripe, which is depleted color, and right next to it, we'll see some redder colors right next to the gray. So that's the depletion, and this is the concentration in the fragipan. Fragipans are firm, they are brittle. When I say brittle, you actually take the structure and crush them in your fingers and it pops, it explodes. Redoxomorphic features is a new word for what we used to call models or drainage modeling, because there were many reasons that soils could be multicolored, which is what modeling means. So they came up with a whole language so it would be more clear in describing what do we mean by differing colors, because there's differing colors for different reasons. So on the left, you'll see a multicolor soil with what we call high chroma, that's the reddish orange, and low chroma, that's the gray, and combined, that's a redoxomorphic feature. When soils are uniform in color, they are generally well drained. So here's just a close-up of a fragipan soil, and again, there's a matrix color, a background color, a gray color, and a red color. And those three, all of that together are redoxomorphic features. But this particular clod of soil is so firm and dense that the roots can't go through it and the water can't go through it. That's what causes the perch water table. And there are other reasons for colors mixing up in a soil. So in a different pattern, here is a soil where the surface is an organic dark brown. The subsoil, this is your eluviated layer that we'll see in a virgin unplowed forest. It's gray, sometimes pinkish gray, and immediately below it will be a very bright red color, which is the sesquioxides. So the bright color left the pale color just by migrating down. Where does this happen? In sandy soils, in acid soils, and in well-drained soils. And those are the three criteria that your chestnut guide, the Pennsylvania Chestnut Growers Guide, says you're going to be looking for: the sandy, the well-drained, the acid soil. So here is just a handful of soil. Again, this is the depleted color and this is the concentrated color. And if a place has never been plowed, you will find this and can find it throughout most of Pennsylvania. But mostly, as we get to the more urbanized areas, the land has been cleared and plowed and isn't ever going to see this again. So there is a pH, there's many pH measuring devices, and I use a little chemical reagent one. And when this is screaming yellow, it's acid. And when it's blue, it's not, it's neutral. And I got to use this technique a lot on a study related to the restoration of red spruce in West Virginia. And the U.S. Forest Service in the Monongahela National Forest was looking for spodic horizons, these white and red soils, to determine where to plant the new plantings of red spruce, to bring that back, because that's an almost extinct species also. Earthworms don't like acidity. So my experience is if I see earthworms, I know it was limed and it isn't as acid. Below 5.5, they don't exist, and they need good drainage, they need air, and they create good soil conditions, and they are also indicative of good soil conditions. Here's the platy. This is in a farm field with platy soils. When I take these pieces of plates in my hand and break them out, they truly look like china plates. They just keep layering and layering, and they are the result of compaction from the top. This is way more than a plow pan. This is a lot of traffic over an area. On the right, I won't go into this, that was the Monongahela National Forest where the red spruce is being regenerated. And this old pipeline that was in there for 50 years, the compaction hasn't left. Here is a plow layer. So this surface has been mixed to 12 inches, dark brown mixing, and no original E horizon or BS horizon. So man has made this plow layer. If it regrew to trees, that plow layer would still be there and that surface soil would still be mixed. We have a lot of evidence of man in the woods: stone walls, hedgerow berms, tannery ponds, compacted paths, and dumps. As soon as I see the rocks have been rearranged, I know somebody managed it for agriculture. So we're back to, what does the American chestnut want? The planting guide that was produced by Pennsylvania chapter says well-drained, acidic soil, sandy to loamy texture. You can scout for good drainage by looking for the convex landscapes. You can find your way to those well-drained landscapes. You can alter acidity if you do not have the acidity, and but you can't change the soil texture, and you can't get rid of a fragipan. So that's why you got to find the convex, better drained landscapes. That's just me, and I'm done.
Fantastic, right on time. So I'm sad to hear that you can't eradicate a fragipan. I think that's I think caused a lot of issues, because often they're pretty far down, and so the chestnuts will grow for maybe even 10 years and do really well, but then that fragipan impedes further growth, and trees may die age 15, 20, and people are like, what happened? And oftentimes it in my opinion, and maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, it's this compacted layer that's maybe 3-4 foot down. Would that
Yes,
make sense?
yes, and that layer is aligned with the concave landscape. So the chances of not hitting it are when you aim for if you aim for that soil survey area that's mapped well drained, or somewhat poorly drained, and poorly drained are where you don't want to be. So well drained and moderately well drained are the drainage classes you want to aim for. You'll find then the species growing there indicate the good drainage, and at least 20 inches of clearance is what I would recommend. 20 to 24 inches of no fragipan and no evidence of perched water table. And your standards are really the same as going out looking for septic system sites. That 20 inches is what we need for soil to be aerated and to breathe and to support deeper rooting.
Now I've got two questions, and I know
Yes.
I'm breaking the rules by going a little farther along into the schedule. Sorry, Mary. But two questions related to Mike Alcott asks, how accurate are NRCS soil boundaries? And you and I talked about this a little bit yesterday. This is Mike's particular property in Potter County, where he's been doing digging and looking, and he thinks that, and I agree with him. I've seen this with soil surveys, that often what it says, they're off by 100 or more feet. Is that your experience, or what?
Absolutely. I mean, I personally made the soil surveys knowing that I did it with hand tools, 1,000 acres a day. They are not precise. And so when you're talking about a micro terrain or even 5 acres, you are not going to match the soil survey. The soil survey protects itself by saying there are inclusions of other soils, shallow to bedrock, poorer drainage, and you're finding those exceptions. And I would say a good 30 to 40% are not what the soil survey says, which is why you really need to stand back and look at shape and what's growing there. And you can do your own micro mapping, or you can dig holes and begin to look for these features of the modeling or that evidence of the fragipan. Yeah, if it's there, it's going to turn the roots sideways.
Can you speak a little bit about the relationship between drainage and saturated hydraulic conductivity and permeability? How are those related? How are they different? And then, I think drainage is important for chestnut, but I think even more important, not only how the water gets in, but how the water moves through. And I guess I haven't done a really good job for myself knowing, how do we measure permeability versus drainage, and make better recommendations to growers on how to measure permeability or KSAT.
Okay. I don't really think it's necessary to be doing KSAT tests and permeability. What you need is an educated person looking at a soil profile, and then it's all the evidence is just instantly observable. Where soil is permeable, the structure is loose. The friability is soft. I mean, it's not compact and tight. Where the fragipan exists, you can look at it in July and there's no water, but you look at that same spot in February and water will pour in over that layer. So between November and April, we have that seasonal high water table, and the water table, the roots and the water all stop at the same point and they go sideways. And sideways means if you're flat, you're stuck in a wetland, and if you're pitched or sloped at all, the water moves away until it finds that concave landscape, but it still rides just laterally across this restriction. The restriction could be rock, but the restriction is more frequently this tight fragipan layer. And so there's nothing you can do to break it up, make it go away. You can elevate your soil like we do with raised beds. You can add material on top to get more rooting zone, but your best bet is to go hunting for the convex landscape without the fragipan. So you asked about, do you need a test? You don't need to measure it. You just need to observe it. You can test it, but it's just extra expense and effort.
Good, good. Well, Laurel, Steve says on here, thank you. I'd love to have you return for a part 2. I agree. I think there's just, I mean, I know that you guys go through years and years of education and on the ground experience to become a certified soil scientist. So obviously there's way more to talk about. And I hope that in the future I can pick your brain a little bit more, and maybe we can even come up with some standards for chestnut that are a little bit better than well-drained and acidic. But thank you for joining us and sharing your experience and expertise. That was really fantastic. If you can stick around, that's great. I know Janice Bauman, she's joining us. Janice, can you, Laurel, if you can stop